This episode contains detailed discussions of genocide, concentration camps, and systematic ethnic cleansing that some listeners may find deeply disturbing. Close your eyes and imagine this. February 8 of 1984. Sarajevo. The world's gaze is fixed on a city that seems to embody humanity's highest aspirations. Vuko, the wolf mascot, leads athletes from 49 nations into Koševo Stadium, while millions watch what organizers proudly call the Olympics of Joy and Peace. The Dinaric Alps rise like cathedral spires around a celebration of everything Yugoslavia claimed to represent. This is the last time the world will see Sarajevo as a symbol of hope rather than one of horror. In just 8 years, those same mountain slopes will bristle with artillery. That stadium will be pockmarked with shell holes, its seats torn apart by desperate residents burning anything for warmth during a siege longer than Stalingrad. The Olympic Village will house refugees whose neighbors have become their executioners. In the VIP box, Branko Mikulic, the organizing committee president, tells visiting dignitaries, "Today, Sarajevo shows the world what Yugoslavia represents. Unity in diversity, brotherhood among nations, a bridge between East and West." Below them, the crowd erupts as the Yugoslav team enters. Slovenes and Macedonians, Serbs and Croats, Bosniaks and Montenegrins, marching together under the Red Star flag. It's a moment of pure possibility when difference feels like strength rather than fracture. What none of them can foresee, but would have seemed like madness to suggest, is that this celebration of diversity will become its own death warrant. The very qualities that make Bosnia Yugoslavia's crown jewel will make it the site of Europe's worst atrocities since the Holocaust. Bosnia-Herzegovina exists as Yugoslavia's most complex genetic sequence. Roughly 44% Muslim, 31% Serb, 17% Croat, with smaller communities filling the gaps. Unlike other republics where one group could claim comfortable majorities, Bosnia functions as a permanent balancing act where no single voice drowns out the others. This complexity, once Bosnia's greatest strength in a unified Yugoslavia, will become its fatal weakness as the federation fragments. When other republics pursue independence based on clear ethnic majorities, Bosnia faces a choice that isn't really a choice at all. Remain in a Soviet-dominated rump Yugoslavia that no longer wants them, or declare independence despite the violent opposition of a third of their population. As the Olympic flame burns against Sarajevo's winter sky, few suspect we're witnessing the end of an era, the last moment when Bosnia's diversity will be celebrated rather than weaponized. This mixed character represents possibility rather than a problem that demands a final solution. This is part 6 of our series on the Yugoslavian breakup, Bosnia's Heart of Darkness. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. We've now reached the point of our story at which things get really dark. From Slovenia's surgical separation through Croatia's devastating homeland war, we've watched how ethnic nationalism transforms neighbors into enemies, how the bonds that hold diverse communities together can be severed with terrifying speed when the right pressures are applied in the right places. Today, we descend into the heart of darkness itself, Bosnia-Herzegovina, where Yugoslavia's grand experiment in multi-ethnic federation faced its ultimate test and suffered its most catastrophic failure. This is the story of systematic attempts to solve the problem of diversity through elimination, making territories ethnically pure by removing or destroying the people who complicated simple national narratives. What happened in Bosnia between 1992 and 1995 reintroduced terms like ethnic cleansing and concentration camps into the European vocabulary. It witnessed systematic mass rape deployed as a weapon of war, the deliberate targeting of cultural heritage to erase historical memory, and the calculated starvation of civilian populations. Most horrifically, it culminated in Srebrenica, the worst massacre on European soil since World War II. But here's what makes Bosnia's tragedy so profoundly disturbing. This wasn't the eruption of ancient tribal hatreds, as lazy analysts would later claim. This was the calculated destruction of a society that had actually worked, where diversity had been not just tolerated, but celebrated, where intermarriage was so common it was unremarkable, where cosmopolitan culture had transcended ethnic boundaries for generations. To understand this descent into barbarity, we must examine the psychology of impossible choices. How Bosnia's complexity became its doom. How local grievances were manipulated by nationalist entrepreneurs who understood that fear is politics' most reliable currency. And how international responses inadvertently enabled the very outcomes they claim to prevent. Let's start with that impossible choice. The psychological trap that caught Bosnia between options that weren't really options. As Yugoslavia collapsed around it like a house whose supporting walls had been systematically removed. Transport yourself to Sarajevo, October 14th of 1991. The Bosnian parliament meets in an emergency session while Croatia's war rages to the west, and federal institutions collapse like dominoes. The chamber itself reflects Bosnia's ethnic complexity. Muslims, Serbs, and Croats sit in party blocks that roughly mirror the republic's demographic division. But the debate cuts across those simple lines in ways that reveal just how artificial those categories really are. Watch Alija Izetbegovic as he rises to present the case for independence. At 66, this Muslim intellectual carries himself with the careful dignity of someone who's learned to navigate minefields. He brings gravitas, earned through decades as a dissident, imprisoned twice by communist authorities for advocating Islamic values and Bosniak rights in a system that preferred his Muslims secular and silent. His bearing is almost professorial, but his words carry the weight of a leader who understands he's about to make a choice that will determine whether his people live or die. We face a stark choice, he tells the assembly. His voice measured despite the enormity of the moment. Each word is chosen like a chess move, because he knows that a single miscalculation could trigger the bloodbath everyone fears. Remain in a Yugoslavia increasingly dominated by Milosevic's Serbia, or declare our sovereignty and seek international recognition as other republics have done. There is no third option. No Yugoslav federation is left to preserve. From across the chamber, Radovan Karadzic, rises to respond. And if you want to understand how intellectuals can become war criminals, then study this man. He's a psychiatrist turned politician. He combines genuine credentials with a growing radicalism that seems to feed on its own rhetoric. His presence is imposing. Tall, with wild hair that will later earn him comparisons to medieval warlords. But in 1991, he still wears the tailored suit of a modern politician. His rhetoric still wrapped in constitutional language rather than naked ethnic mythology. Separation is not liberation, but suicide, Karadzic counters, his voice carrying theatrical training from his brief career as a poet. And here's the terrifying thing. He's not entirely wrong. Bosnia cannot survive as an independent state. We are too mixed, too complex. Independence means civil war, means rivers of blood. Serbian people will never accept minority status in a Muslim-dominated state. The exchange crystallizes Bosnia's psychological trap. Independence requires a constitutional majority, which Muslims and Croats can mathematically provide. But meaningful independence, the kind that doesn't require constant warfare to maintain, requires something mathematics can't deliver: the consent of all major communities. And that consent is precisely what Serbs backed by JNA military power absolutely refused to provide. The session ends without resolution. A perfectly Bosnian outcome that satisfies no one while offending everyone. But outside the parliamentary chamber, forces are already in motion that will make democratic deliberation irrelevant. The window for peaceful solution is closing with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. By March 1992, the psychological pressures had crystallized into an existential crisis that made war feel almost inevitable. That terrible moment when everyone can see the approaching disaster, but no one possesses the power to prevent it. The European community, still drunk in its successful management of German reunification and eager to prove its diplomatic prowess without American oversight, sponsored a referendum on independence. The reasoning seemed unassailable. Let democratic choice determine Bosnia's future. The referendum, held on March 29 through the 30th of 1992, produced exactly the outcome everyone predicted and no one actually wanted. Massive turnout among Muslims and Croats produced overwhelming support for independence, 99.7% from 63.4% of eligible voters. But the near-total Serbian boycott made the result ethnically loop-sided in ways that statistics couldn't capture. Mathematically, independence had won decisively. Psychologically, it represented a decision by 2/3 of the population to create a state that 1/3 would fight to the death to prevent. Misra Hajic, a Sarajevo architect who voted in the referendum, described the atmosphere with the precision of someone who understood he was living through history. Voting felt both triumphant and terrifying. Yes, we were finally choosing our destiny after centuries of being chosen for. The Serbian neighborhoods were empty, shuttered, preparing for something none of us wanted to imagine. It felt like voting for a future while standing on quicksand. What followed wasn't classical interstate war between uniformed armies fighting for clearly defined objectives. This was something far more intimate and infinitely more brutal. Neighbor against neighbor warfare, where front lines ran through apartment buildings and former friends found themselves calculating whether the person across the hall might be planning their murder. The war's opening shot came not from military units deploying according to strategic plans, but from a wedding celebration that went catastrophically wrong. Let me take you inside this moment, because it contains everything you need to understand about how Bosnia died. Sarajevo, April 5, 1992. Nijaz Durakovic, and Admira Ishmich are celebrating their wedding at the Holiday Inn, that gleaming symbol of Sarajevo's international aspirations. The reception includes guests from all ethnic backgrounds, family friends who've shared decades of birthdays, holidays, and life milestones. These aren't abstract demographic categories sitting around wedding tables. These are people whose lives have been so intertwined that separation seems literally unimaginable. The couple themselves embody Bosnia's integrative ideal in ways that make ethnic nationalism seem like a category error rather than political destiny. He is Muslim, she's Serbian. Their marriage representing thousands of similar mixed unions that make ethnic separation appear both impossible and almost absurd. Their love story is Bosnia's love story, the belief that human connections can transcend the artificial boundaries that politicians draw around identity. Outside, tensions are rising as Serbian paramilitaries establish checkpoints around the city, tightening the noose that will become the siege. But inside the hotel, champagne flows and traditional songs play as if politics could be held at bay by celebration and goodwill. It's a beautiful delusion, and for a few hours, it almost works. The shooting stars when the wedding party exits onto the street. Sniper fire from Serbian positions on surrounding hills, part of siege preparations already well underway, sends guests diving for cover behind cars. The bride's white dress is splattered with blood, though thankfully not her own. The groom pulls her into the hotel lobby as bullets shatter the glass doors behind them. The sound, like the breaking of every assumption they'd ever made about their city, their neighbors, and their future. In 30 seconds, Breakup later recalled with the stunned precision of trauma. We went from celebrating our future to wondering if we'd survive the night. The war didn't begin with armies or declarations. It began with the realization that the streets we'd walked safely for years had become killing zones, that neighbors we've known for decades had become potential executioners. This transformation from normal urban life to urban warfare happened with stunning speed across Bosnia, as if some terrible spell had been cast that turned familiar landscapes into alien battlefields. Cities that had functioned as integrated communities for centuries suddenly segregated along ethnic lines that most residents would have been hard-pressed to identify just months earlier. Neighborhoods became territories, apartments became bunkers, and local knowledge of who lived where became intelligence with life and death implications. To understand the savagery that followed, we must examine the psychology of systemic destruction, how local conflicts were methodically transformed into campaigns of ethnic cleansing that followed predictable patterns with the precision of industrial processes. The methodology, perfected in Croatia and now applied to Bosnia with devastating efficiency, followed stages that transformed war crimes from spontaneous brutality into organized policy. As we discussed before, first came isolation. The next step was intimidation, then ultimatums, and finally elimination. The systemic murder of those who remained, destruction of cultural and religious sites, and the erasure of historical evidence that targeted groups had ever lived there. The landscape itself had to be cleansed of inconvenient memories. Let me take you to Bijeljina, eastern Bosnia, on April of 1992, where these techniques were field-tested before being deployed across the region. This mixed town near the Serbian border became the laboratory for methods that would later be applied with industrial efficiency throughout Bosnia. Enter Selsko Rasnatovic, better known as Arkan, leading his paramilitary tigers in what he calls liberating the town from Muslim extremists. Arkan fascinates and terrifies in equal measure. A former bank robber turned warlord who represents the marriage of organized crime and ethnic nationalism that will characterize much of the coming violence. His tigers aren't motivated primarily by historical grievance or nationalist ideology, so they deploy both. They're driven by opportunities for enrichment that ethnic conflict provides, war as business by other means. The operation in Bijeljina unfolds with methodical precision that reveals this isn't spontaneous ethnic hatred but calculated social engineering. Tigers establish checkpoints with the efficiency of tax collectors. They separate Muslims from Serbian residents, the systematic thoroughness of bureaucrats. They begin killings designed to terrorize rather than to simply eliminate. Bodies are left in the street as warning rather than hidden as evidence. Mosques are destroyed while cameras record the demolition for propaganda purposes. It's a performance, a spectacle designed to send messages to audiences far beyond Bijeljina. But here's what makes ethnic cleansing truly chilling. It requires collaboration, local collaboration. Hasan Nuhanovic, a Muslim teacher who escapes the initial roundup as he hides and observes his neighbors. People he's known for decades participate in or passively observe the persecution of their former friends. The most shocking thing wasn't the strangers with the guns, he later testifies. It was seeing local Serbs had thought their children shared coffee with for many years, pointing to houses where Muslims lived. Ethnic cleansing required local knowledge that only neighbors possess. Maps could show you the streets, but only neighbors could tell you which families had teenage sons, which houses had hidden valuables, which elderly people couldn't run fast enough to escape. This collaboration between paramilitary outsiders and local residents willing to settle personal scores or seize property became central to ethnic cleansing's effectiveness. It wasn't simply imposed by external forces like some kind of military occupation. It grew from internal fractures that the war exposed and exploited. The terrible revelation that the social bonds everyone thought were permanent were actually more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Within days, Bijeljina's Muslim population had fled or been eliminated. What had been a mixed community for centuries became ethnically pure in less than a week, a transformation so complete it was as if the Muslim population had never existed at all. The international media, focused on Sarajevo's telegenic siege, largely missed its rural campaigns that were reshaping Bosnia's demographic map. By the time global attention turned to systemic ethnic cleansing, hundreds of communities had already been cleansed using techniques perfected in places like Bijeljina. While rural ethnic cleansing proceeded with minimal international attention, Sarajevo's siege captured global audiences and headlines across Europe. European civilization seemed to be collapsing in real time on television screens worldwide. The siege of Sarajevo lasted 1,425 days, longer than the siege of Leningrad during World War II. It transformed a cosmopolitan Olympic host city into an urban battlefield where survival required relearning the most basic human activities. How to cross streets without being shot by snipers. How to find water when taps run dry. How to keep warm when heating fuel becomes more precious than gold. Admira Ishmich, the bride whose wedding was interrupted by gunfire, navigates a city that has been psychologically transformed into something unrecognizable. It is August of 1992, and Serbian forces control the hills surrounding Sarajevo like a crown of thorns, turning apartment buildings into sniper nests and artillery positions. The city's center, once a stunning showcase of Ottoman, Austrian, and socialist architecture representing Bosnia's layered history, has become a shooting gallery where crossing certain intersections means making life and death calculations. We've learned to read the city differently, she writes in a diary that would later be published internationally, documenting the psychological geography of siege. Streets aren't addresses anymore, but tactical problems. Do you run across Sniper Alley or take the tunnel route that adds 30 minutes but might keep you alive? The corner grocery store might have bread. Getting there means exposing yourself to positions on that hill where Milan, my former classmate, might be manning a rifle scope, calculating whether to pull the trigger on someone he used to share homework with. The siege created a parallel economy based on survival rather than market principles, a distorted mirror image of normal urban life. Cigarettes became more valuable than money because they could be traded for anything and stored indefinitely. Most perversely, the siege operated by rules that distinguished it from historical precedents and revealed its true psychological purpose. Unlike traditional sieges aimed at forcing military surrender, Sarajevo's siege seemed designed to produce suffering as an end in itself. Just enough humanitarian aid was allowed through to prevent complete starvation, but not enough to maintain normal life. Markets and breadlines were deliberately targeted by artillery to maximize civilian casualties and psychological terror. The infamous Sarajevo Survival Guide, a darkly humorous book written during the siege, captured this surreal atmosphere with gallows humor that became a survival mechanism. How to cross the street. Run zigzag, pray to your preferred deity, and remember that snipers like moving targets but don't always hit them. Style points are awarded for creative obstacle use, but survival matters more than elegance. Fashion note, bulletproof vests are always appropriate, regardless of the season. Even under these impossible conditions, the city maintained elements of its cosmopolitan identity that made ethnic separation seem absurd. The National Theatre continued staging performances in basement shelters, actors performing Shakespeare while artillery shells fell outside. Radio DJs played music that crossed ethnic boundaries while their studios shook from nearby explosions. Interfaith weddings continued, though now they require dodging sniper fire to reach ceremonies where love literally triumphed over hatred. But it was in rural areas, away from international media attention and diplomatic scrutiny, that the war's most systemic horrors unfolded, including the return of concentration camps to European soil 50 years after the liberation of Nazi death camps. The camps discovered in the summer of 1992, Omarska, Karaterm, Trovpolje, and others, shocked international observers who had assumed such institutions belonged permanently to history's dark museum. These weren't prisoner of war camps operating under Geneva Convention protections, or even conventional detention centers with legal oversight. These were systematic instruments of ethnic elimination through murder, torture, and physical destruction. Transport yourself to Omarska, northwestern Bosnia, July of 1992. What was once an iron ore mine has been converted with bureaucratic efficiency into a camp where Muslim and Croatian men are subjected to conditions designed not just to kill them, but to destroy their humanity first. The mine's industrial infrastructure, conveyor belts, sorting buildings, administrative offices, now serve organized murder disguised as imprisonment. Omarska represents ethnic cleansing's logical endpoint, not just removing unwanted populations from territory, but destroying them entirely as a category of human being. An estimated 3,000 men passed through the camp. Fewer than 1,500 survived. Death came through execution, torture, starvation, and diseases that spread through overcrowded facilities lacking basic sanitation. The camp's true purpose was psychological destruction, breaking men before killing them. Listen to Kemal Perjavic, one of the survivors, as he describes the camp's systematic dehumanization. They didn't just want to kill us. They wanted to break us first, to prove that we weren't really human. Roll call, where they call our names and the names of the dead, just to psychologically torture the living. Forced fights between prisoners while guards placed bets like we were animals. Mock executions where you prepare to die, make peace with God, and then drag back to your cell for more torture. They were erasing not just our bodies, but our humanity, our dignity, our sense that we deserve to exist. The camps served multiple purposes beyond simple elimination. revealing the calculated nature of ethnic cleansing as policy rather than passion. They terrorized communities contemplating resistance. Families knew that men taken away might face not just death, but prolonged agony. They provided economic benefit through forced labor and systemic looting of victims' property. Most importantly, they sent unmistakable messages that coexistence was impossible, and separation the only alternative to elimination. When international journalists finally gained access to some camps in August of 1992, the images that emerged shocked a world that thought it had learned history's lessons permanent. Emaciated figures behind barbed wire evoked immediate comparisons to Nazi concentration camps, forcing recognition that Europe's dark history wasn't safely buried in museums but could be resurrected under the right circumstances. The arrival of international peacekeepers under UN PROFOR represented unprecedented humanitarian intervention, but also highlighted the fundamental contradictions inherent in peacekeeping without peace to keep. General Louis Mackenzie, commanding UN's forces in Sarajevo, captured this impossible dilemma in his memoirs. We were supposed to maintain ceasefires that didn't exist, protect civilians in war deliberately targeting them, and remain neutral between victims and perpetrators of genocide. These missions were conceptually impossible, like being asked to referee a boxing match where one fighter is using brass knuckles while the other one is blindfolded. The peacekeepers' light blue helmets became symbols of both international commitment and institutional impotence. They could escort humanitarian convoys when all sides permitted access, but couldn't force passage when blocked. They could document atrocities with bureaucratic precision, but not prevent them from occurring. Most frustratingly, they operated under rules of engagement that often prevented them from using force to protect civilians they were ostensibly deployed to help. This became tragically clear in Srebrenica, where the gap between the UN promise and the UN capability would contribute to Europe's worst massacre since World War II. Srebrenica, July 1995. Picture this small town in eastern Bosnia, designated a UN safe area, supposedly protected by international peacekeepers from Serbian forces surrounding it, like hunters surrounding prey. For 3 years, it had served as a haven for Muslims driven from surrounding areas by ethnic cleansing campaigns. What should have been temporary refuge became permanent limbo, as diplomatic solutions remained forever elusive. The town's strategic position made it both a symbol and a target. A Muslim enclave deep in Serbian-controlled territory, sustained by helicopter resupply and defended by lightly armed Dutch peacekeepers who possessed neither the mandate nor the firepower to resist determined attack. When General Ratko Mladić's forces finally overran Srebrenica's defenses on July 11th, collapse came with shocking speed and revealed how illusory the protection had always been. What followed over the next several days represents systematic execution of unarmed civilians on a scale unseen in Europe since the Holocaust. An estimated 8,000 Muslim men and boys were separated from women and children, transported to killing sites, and executed by firing squad. The killings were methodical, documented by perpetrators themselves, and designed to eliminate military-age males who might someday threaten Serbian control of the region. Hasan Nuhanovic, same teacher who had escaped ethnic cleansing in Bijeljina 3 years earlier, lost his father and brother in Srebrenica despite working as a translator for Dutch peacekeepers. I translated for peacekeepers who promised protection they couldn't deliver. I watched UN officers assure my family that they were safe, speaking with the confidence of people who believed their blue helmets carried magical protective powers. Then, I watched Serbian forces separate my father and brother from the women and the children, while Dutch soldiers just stood by helplessly, their weapons useless against political constraints that they didn't understand. The Srebrenica massacre finally triggered decisive international intervention. NATO airstrikes that shifted the military balance and created conditions for the Dayton Peace Agreement, ending the war in December of 1995. But it came too late for the 8,000 men whose executions could have been prevented by earlier, more decisive action. By the time peace came to Bosnia, the damage was irreversible in ways that statistics can't capture. An estimated 100,000 people had died, roughly half civilians deliberately targeted because of their ethnicity. Over 2 million had been displaced, many permanently scattered across the continents. Centuries of cultural heritage had been systematically destroyed. Most tragically, communities that had functioned as integrated wholes for generations had been permanently segregated by violence and made coexistence impossible. The Dayton Agreement, negotiated at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, reflected this new reality rather than attempting to reverse it. Bosnia survived as a state, but ceased to exist as a society. The country was divided into ethnic entities, the Bosniak-Croat Federation and the Republika Srpska, that barely cooperated on matters of common concern. Cities like Mostar became physically divided by ethnic boundaries that cut through neighborhoods like surgical scars. Even today, children attend separate schools based on ethnicity, learning different versions of the same history from textbooks that might as well be describing different planets. We are in Sarajevo in 2005, 10 years after Dayton. The Olympic city has been rebuilt with international assistance, but not restored to what it was. Scars remain visible to those who know how to look. Buildings still pockmarked by shell holes that no amount of stucco can completely hide. Cemeteries expanded with graves of siege victims, and streets that have subtly segregated themselves along ethnic lines that didn't exist before the war. The Bosnia War established ethnic cleansing as an effective, if horrifying, method of conflict resolution. Despite international condemnation and war crimes prosecutions that sent dozens of perpetrators to prison, the ethnic cleansers largely achieved their political objectives. Ethnically separated territories, demographic changes that reinforced nationalist narratives, and political systems that institutionalized ethnic division as the only alternative to ethnic warfare. This success sent ominous signals across regions where ethnic diversity existed under political pressure. From the Caucasus to the Balkans to parts of Africa, Bosnia demonstrated that systematic violence against civilians could achieve political objectives if applied with sufficient determination, and international responses remained constrained by competing principles and interests. Most soberly, Bosnia showed that genocide remains possible in modern Europe when sufficient political will exists to pursue it and international response remains constrained. The continent that promised never again, after the Holocaust, watched systematic murder unfold on television screens while debating appropriate diplomatic responses. The psychological wounds remain open, the ethnic divisions institutionalized, the trust destroyed perhaps permanently. Next time, on Double Helix, we'll examine how the conflict that began Yugoslavia's dissolution also marked its final end, where Milosevic's rise to power at Kosovo Polje in 1987 came full circle with NATO intervention in 1999, where the Kosovo Liberation Army challenged Serbian control through guerrilla warfare that transformed forgotten farmers into international cause célèbre, and where humanitarian intervention evolved from diplomatic aspiration to military reality. We'll witness how the province that sparked Yugoslav nationalism became the grave of the Yugoslav idea, how a forgotten corner of southeastern Europe became the center of global attention, and how the final war of Yugoslav secession established precedents for humanitarian intervention that continue shaping international relations today. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.